A cowboy saves a dying girl in the middle of the desert, only to find his home under siege by an Apache war party that very night. With war drums pounding and arrows drawn, he faces a terrifying truth. The girl he rescued is the daughter of their chief, and they've come to take her back at any cost. If this hooked, you don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and stick around for the full story that'll keep your heart racing until the very end. The wind howled like a lonesome coyote across the Arizona desert, kicking up red dust that stung Jed Carter's face as he drove his horses toward the corral. "You ain't gonna outrun me tonight," he muttered to the lead mare, her ears twitching against the April chill. The moon hung thin and pale, barely lighting the trail back to his modest ranch at the foot of Sierra Blanca. It was late past midnight, and the quiet of the desert was broken only by the clop of hooves and the creak of his saddle. Then a sound faint like a wounded animal came from the creek bed nearby. Jed's hand went to the rifle slung across his back, his eyes narrowing. He'd seen plenty in these parts. Coyotes, rattlers, even bandits. But what he found wasn't any of those. There, half hidden by the scrub and the shadows of cottonwoods, lay a girl crumpled like a discarded rag doll. Her dark hair was matted with dirt, her buckskin dress torn to ribbons, and her wrists bore raw red marks where ropes had bitten deep. Jed froze, his breath catching. An Apache, no doubt her features sharp and proud even in unconsciousness, told him that much. Bringing her to his ranch was asking for trouble, the kind that could burn a man's life down in a place where folks didn't take kindly to strangers, especially not ones from the tribes. He glanced back at the trail home where his 6-year-old daughter Ellie slept soundly in their little house. Every instinct screamed to keep moving to leave this problem for someone else. But then she stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, wild with fear and pain, before she slumped back into the dirt. Jed cursed under his breath, swung down from his horse and knelt beside her. "You're in a bad way, ain't you?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, her skin clammy under the desert's cold night air. The bruises on her arms, dark and angry, told a story of cruelty he didn't want to imagine. He couldn't leave her here, not like this, not when the desert took no prisoners and dawn was still hours off. With a grunt, he lifted her light as a child, but trembling with fever, and settled her across his saddle. The ride back to the ranch was slow, the weight of his choice heavier than the girl herself. By the time he reached the homestead, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness. The house was dark, save for the faint glow of a lantern he'd left burning for Ellie. He carried the girl to a small wooden room off the cattle shed, a cluttered space with a cot, a blanket, and an old stove he rarely used. It was far enough from the main house to keep Ellie safe, close enough he could keep an eye on her. He laid her down, her breathing uneven, and fetched a bucket of water and a rag. As he cleaned the dirt from her face, she stirred again, her eyes snapping open, dark, wary, like a cornered animal. "Don't touch me," she rasped, her voice cracked but fierce, trying to push herself up and failing. "Easy now," Jed said, stepping back, hands raised. "I ain't here to hurt you, just trying to keep you from dying out there." She stared at him, her gaze darting to the door, the window anywhere but his face. He saw the rope burns again, the way her fingers curled protectively over her ribs. Whatever she'd been through, it had left her broken in ways water and a warm bed couldn't fix. "You got a name?" he asked, keeping his voice low like he was calming a spooked horse. She didn't answer, just pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Jed nodded, not pushing. "All right, rest up. You're safe here for now." He left her with the lantern dimmed and locked the shed door, not to trap her, but to keep the world out. Morning came slow, the sun creeping over the mountains, painting the desert gold. Jed was up before dawn, checking the horses and mending a fence post that had rotted through. Ellie bounded out of the house, her braid bouncing, her eyes bright with the curiosity only a child could muster. "Pa, you see that hawk up there?" she called, pointing at the sky. Jed smiled, but his thoughts were on the stranger in the shed. He'd told Ellie to stay clear of it, saying the roof was loose and dangerous. She didn't need to know about the girl, not yet. But Ellie, being Ellie, had a nose for secrets. By mid-morning, she'd slipped away while Jed was hauling water, and he found her standing in the shed's doorway, staring at the stranger. The girl was awake, sitting up on the cot, her face pale but her eyes sharp. Ellie tilted her head, unafraid. "Are you a princess from the forest?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. The girl's lips twitched, the first hint of softness Jed had seen. "Tala," she said simply, her voice still rough but warmer now, like she'd found something worth speaking for. Jed stepped in his shadow, filling the doorway. "Ellie, I told you to stay out of here," he said, firm but not harsh. She pouted, crossing her arms. "But she's nice, Pa. She ain't gonna hurt nobody." "Go on now," he said, pointing toward the house. Ellie huffed, but obeyed, casting one last glance at Tala. Jed turned to the girl, his jaw tight. "You're Apache, ain't you? Folks round here don't take kindly to that. You bring trouble with you." Tala met his gaze, unflinching. "Trouble already found me," she said, her voice steady despite the pain etched into her face. "I just need a few days. I'll work for it. I can tend horses, mend clothes, whatever you need." Jed studied her, weighing her words. She didn't beg, didn't grovel, but there was a desperation in her eyes she couldn't hide. He nodded slowly. "All right. Few days. But you stay out of sight. My girl don't need to be mixed up in whatever you're running from." The next few days settled into a quiet rhythm, though it wasn't easy. Tala kept her word, rising at dawn to help with chores. She brushed the horses with a gentle hand, her movements sure, and practiced like she'd been born in a saddle. She washed clothes in the creek, her fingers quick despite the lingering bruises. For Ellie, she wove bracelets from willow bark, her hands steady as she showed the girl how to twist the strands. Jed watched from a distance, his heart tugging in ways he didn't care to name. She was a mystery, this woman strong, broken, and carrying a weight he couldn't yet fathom. But the neighbors noticed. Old Mrs. Haskell, whose ranch bordered Jed's, squinted through her fence one morning and saw Tala hauling water. "You got an Indian in your shed, Carter," she called, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You know what kind of trouble that brings." "She's just passing through," Jed said, keeping his tone even. "Ain't nobody's business but mine." Mrs. Haskell snorted. "Folks won't like it. You mark my words." Across the valley, whispers spread, folks at the general store, the blacksmith, even the preacher, all murmuring about the savage hiding at Carter's place. Jed ignored them, but the weight of their judgment hung heavy. Ellie, though, didn't care a whit for warnings. Jed had told her to steer clear of Tala, but by the third day he caught her sneaking into the shed with a slate and chalk. "I'm teaching her to write her name," Ellie declared, her chin jutted out defiantly. Tala sat cross-legged on the floor, tracing letters with a shy smile, her dark hair falling over her shoulder as Ellie giggled beside her. "Ellie," I said. Jed started, but the sight of his daughter's grin stopped him cold. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're gonna be the death of me, girl." He let it go too soft on her to argue. Truth was seeing Ellie happy warmed something in him, something that had been cold since his wife passed. Tala, for her part, kept her distance from Jed, her eyes guarded but softening when she looked at Ellie. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Jed found her by the corral rubbing down his old mare. The way she moved, careful and sure, stirred something in him, a quiet admiration, maybe more. "You're good with horses," he said, leaning against the fence. "They listen better than people," she replied, not looking up, but her voice held a hint of a smile. He chuckled, the sound surprising him. "Ain't that the truth?" For a moment they stood there, the desert stretching out around them, the silence comfortable in a way he hadn't known in years. But the peace didn't last. On the 5th day, Tala's strength faltered. She'd been hiding the worst of her injuries, a deep gash on her side festering under her torn dress. Jed found her slumped against the shed wall, her face gray, her breathing shallow. "Why didn't you say something?" he demanded, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering unsure. "Didn't want to be a burden?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've done enough." He shook his head, jaw tight. "You ain't a burden, but you're leaving if you're gonna die on me." He meant to take her to town, to the dock, maybe even turn her over to someone who could handle whatever she was running from. It was safer for him, for Ellie. Tala's eyes filled with tears, her hands clutching his sleeve. "Please," she sobbed, her voice breaking in a way that cut him deep. "Don't send me away. They'll find me. They'll drag me back, and I can't go back to that." Her words spilled out raw and desperate, her body shaking with fear and pain. "I'd rather die here than go back to them." Jed's heart twisted. He'd seen fear before, but this was different, bone deep, the kind that came from knowing what waited in the dark. He didn't know her story, not all of it, but he knew enough. "All right," he said softly, his voice rough with something he couldn't name. "You stay. But you're getting that wound cleaned and you ain't arguing." He carried her inside, settling her on the cot, and fetched water and bandages. As he worked, her tears slowed her eyes, watching him with a mix of gratitude and wariness. Ellie peeked in her face, pale. "Is she gonna be okay, Pa?" "She will be," Jed said, more certain than he felt. He didn't look at Tala as he bandaged her side, but her quiet "thank you" lingered in the air long after. Words spread faster than a brush fire. By week's end, the neighbors' whispers turned to outright scorn. "He's got a wild Indian living with him," the blacksmith muttered at the store. "Ain't right a man with a little girl." But Tala didn't hide. When Mrs. Haskell's boy came down with a fever, Tala mixed a poultice from desert herbs, her hands steady as she showed the old woman how to apply it. The boy was up and running in 2 days. When the widow crane's mare went lame, Tala brewed a salve from sage and yucca, and the horse trotted again by Sunday. Slowly, grudgingly, folk started coming to her first for help, then with thanks. Mrs. Haskell even brought her a basket of apples, muttering, "Didn't expect you to be so useful." Ellie, meanwhile, was Tala's shadow. "Say cat," she'd chirp, holding up her slate, and Tala would repeat it, her accent thick, but her effort earnest. Jed caught them laughing one afternoon, Tala's braid swinging as she tried to pronounce apple, and something in his chest stirred a warmth he hadn't felt since his wife's laughter filled the house. He turned away, busying himself with a fence post, but the feeling stayed. The days stretched on the Arizona sun, baking the red dirt around the ranch, and Tala wove herself into their lives, quiet but sure, like a thread stitching up an old wound. She'd rise before dawn, her silhouette moving through the corral as she brushed the horses, her hands gentle but firm, like she'd known them all her life. She'd kneel beside Ellie when the girl caught a fever one evening, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead and humming a soft Apache tune that seemed to calm the child's restless tossing. Jed watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, his heart caught between gratitude and caution. Tala's presence was a comfort, but it was also a risk, and he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was waiting just beyond the horizon. One evening, as the fire in the hearth crackled and cast shadows on the rough-hewn walls, Tala sat cross-legged on the floor, weaving a basket from willow strips. Ellie was curled up beside her, half asleep, her head resting on Tala's knee. Jed sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the rhythm of the task steadying his thoughts. The quiet was comfortable, broken only by the pop of burning logs, until Tala spoke, her voice low and halting. "They came for me," she said, her eyes fixed on the basket, her fingers still moving. "A band of warriors from a neighboring tribe. They wanted me for their chief's son, not for love, but for pride. My face, my name, it's a prize to them." Jed's hands stilled on the rifle, his gaze lifting to her. She didn't look up, but her voice carried a weight that filled the room. "I ran when their caravan got lost in the mountains. Days without food, hiding in caves, dodging their scouts. I thought I'd die out there till you found me." He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Why didn't you go back to your people?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Tala's fingers paused, the willow strip dangling. "My people. They'd send me back to avoid a feud. My father's a chief, but even he can't break tradition. I'd rather die free than live in chains." Her eyes met his, then dark and fierce, and Jed felt a jolt like he'd touched a live wire. There was a strength in her that matched the desert itself, unyielding, wild, and beautiful, in a way that made his throat tighten. He cleared his throat, looking away. "Lost my Sarah 3 years ago." He said the words coming unbidden, rough like gravel. "Fever took her quick and cruel. Left me and Ellie to figure it out alone. Ain't been easy keeping this place going, keeping her safe." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the rifle, the metal cool under his touch. "Sometimes I see her in Ellie's laugh, or in the way the light hits the mountains at dusk. Hurts, but it's all I got left." Tala set the basket down, her eyes softening. "You carry her in your heart," she said quietly. "That's not loss, Jed. That's love that don't quit." She reached across the table, her hand brushing his, a fleeting touch that sent a warmth through him, unexpected and disarming. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world narrowed to just them. The fire's glow, the quiet of the night, the unspoken pull that made his heart stutter. He leaned closer, drawn by something he couldn't name, and her breath caught as their lips met, soft and hesitant, then deepening with a hunger neither had acknowledged until now. A giggle broke the spell. "Pa, you're kissin'." Tala Ellie's voice piped up from the floor, her eyes wide with delight. Jed pulled back his face, burning red, while Tala laughed, her cheeks flushed. "You little sneak," Jed said, scooping Ellie up and tickling her until she squealed. "Ain't you supposed to be asleep? You're supposed to kiss her better," Pa Ellie teased, grinning at Tala, who covered her face with her hands, still laughing. The room filled with their laughter, a sound that felt like home, warm and full, and for the first time in years, Jed let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the world could be kind again. But the world outside their little ranch wasn't so forgiving. The next morning, Jed hitched the wagon and took Tala and Ellie to the market in town, a dusty cluster of shops and saloons nestled in the valley. The air smelled of hay and leather, and the street buzzed with folks bartering for flour and cloth. Tala stayed close, her head down, her shawl pulled tight to hide the bruises still fading on her arms. Jed noticed the stares, sharp, suspicious glances from the townsfolk, their whispers carrying like wind through the sagebrush. "Carter's got himself an Indian," a woman muttered, her basket clutched tight. "Ain't right him bringing her round decent folk." Jed's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, his hand resting lightly on Ellie's shoulder. Tala's face stayed blank, but her eyes flickered with something hurt maybe, or defiance. As they haggled for a sack of potatoes, Jed caught sight of a man lingering by the saloon, his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on Tala. The man's face was hard scarred with a coldness that made Jed's gut twist. Tala froze, her hand tightening on the wagon's edge. "He was there," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "One of the men who took me." Jed followed her gaze, his hand brushing the revolver at his hip. "Stay with Ellie," he said, his voice low. "Don't make a scene." He moved toward the man, but the stranger slipped into the crowd, gone like a shadow. Jed cursed under his breath, the weight of danger settling heavy on his shoulders. That night, after Ellie was tucked in, Jed found fresh tracks near the ranch's fence boots, too clean for a rancher circling the corral. He knelt, his fingers tracing the prints, his mind racing. "They're here," Tala said, stepping out from the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "How many?" Jed asked, standing, his hand still on his gun. "Don't know," she said, "but they won't stop. Not till they have me." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, and he felt that same warmth again, mixed with a fierce need to protect her. "I ain't letting that happen," he said, his voice rough but certain. "We'll keep Ellie safe, and you ain't going nowhere you don't want to go." He sent Ellie to stay with Mrs. Ramirez, the neighbor who'd softened to Tala after her poultice saved her grandson. "Keep her close," Jed told the old woman, who nodded, her eyes kind but worried. Back at the ranch, Jed checked his rifle, loaded extra rounds, and moved Tala's cot to the main house where he could watch her. The night felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The night was black as coal, no moon to light the way when the first torch flickered in the distance. Jed was awake, his rifle across his lap, sitting by the window as Tala slept fitfully on the cot. The air was thick with the smell of dust and danger, and then he heard it, the low thud of hooves, the crackle of fire. He stood, his heart pounding, and shook Tala awake. "They're here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Get to the cattle shed. There's a hatch to the root cellar. Hide Ellie there." Tala nodded, her face pale but resolute, and grabbed the short bow she'd kept hidden under her cot. They moved silently, slipping out the back door as the glow of torches grew closer. Ellie was already in the shed, curled up in the cellar, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay quiet, darlin'," Jed whispered, kissing her forehead. "We'll be back before you know it." The riders circled the ranch, their shadows long and menacing in the torchlight. There were 6 of them, faces painted with war stripes, their horses snorting in the cold night air. One, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, called out, "Carter, hand over the girl, and we'll leave you be." Jed stepped onto the porch, rifle raised, his voice steady. "Ain't nobody here who wants to go with you. Ride on or you'll regret it." The leader laughed, a harsh sound, and raised his torch higher. "You think you can keep her? She's promised to our chief's son. You're just a dirt farmer with a gun." Tala emerged from the shed, her bow drawn, an arrow knocked. "I ain't your prize," she said, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. "I choose my own path." The leader's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, a shot rang out. Jed's bullet caught one rider in the shoulder, and the man fell his horse rearing. Arrows flew in return, one grazing Jed's arm, blood welling up through his shirt. Tala's arrow found its mark, dropping another rider, her hands steady despite the chaos. The fight was brutal, a blur of gunfire and shouts, horses screaming as they bolted. Jed took cover behind a water trough, firing when he could, while Tala moved like a shadow, her arrows silent but deadly. The shed door rattled as Ellie whimpered inside, and Jed's heart clenched, but he couldn't stop. Then, from the darkness, hoofbeats sounded not enemies, but neighbors. Old Man Crane and his sons, alerted by the gunfire, rode up with rifles, their faces grim. "Ain't letting no raiders burn out a good man," Crane shouted, firing into the fray. The tide turned. The raiders, outnumbered and outgunned, retreated into the night, leaving two of their own bleeding on the sand. Jed leaned against the trough, his arm throbbing, his breath ragged. Tala ran to the shed, pulling Ellie from the cellar and holding her tight as the girl sobbed. "I knew you'd keep us safe," Ellie whispered, clinging to Tala's neck. Jed watched them, his chest tight with relief and something deeper, something that felt like love, but hurt, like fear. Inside, by the lantern's dim glow, Tala cleaned Jed's wound, her hands gentle but sure, as she wrapped a cloth around his arm. "You're a fool, Jed Carter," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "Risking your life for me. Ain't just for you," he said, his voice gruff. "For Ellie. For whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the space between them, and she smiled, a small, sad thing. "I'm Goyakla's daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tu Trong of the Chiricahua Apache. I ran to keep my freedom, but they'll come again. For me, for you, for her." She nodded toward Ellie, asleep on the cot, her face streaked with tears. Jed stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. A chief's daughter hiding in his dusty ranch, weaving bracelets for his little girl. He should have been angry, should have felt betrayed, but all he could see was the woman who'd fought beside him, who'd held his daughter through the night. "Don't matter who your pa is," he said finally. "You're here, and that's enough for now." She looked at him, her eyes searching, and something passed between them, a promise unspoken but real. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, and this time neither pulled away. Tala's eyes searched his, a flicker of relief softening the fear that had lingered since the fight. Something passed between them, a promise unspoken but real. His rough fingers brushed hers, calloused from years of roping and mending fences, and the touch sent a warmth through him, steady and unfamiliar. She didn't pull away, her hand lingering, her breath, catching just enough for him to notice. The moment held them fragile as a desert bloom until Ellie's sleepy voice called from the cot. "Pa, I'm thirsty." Jed stepped back, the spell broken, and fetched a tin cup of water, his heart still pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years. The morning after the raid was quiet, too quiet, like the desert was holding its breath. The ranch felt bruised, the corral gate splintered from a stray arrow, the sand still stained dark where blood had spilled. Jed worked to patch the gate, his hammer striking nails with a rhythm that kept his thoughts from wandering too far. Ellie played nearby, stacking stones into a wobbly tower, her laughter a small defiance against the fear of the night before. Tala moved through the chores with her usual grace, weaving a new basket for Ellie, her fingers deft despite the shadows under her eyes. Jed caught himself watching her, the way her braids swayed as she bent over her work, the way her lips curved when Ellie giggled. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of town women, but like the desert itself, raw and enduring, with a strength that made his chest ache. He shook his head, turning back to the gate. "Focus, Carter," he muttered under his breath. But the truth was, Tala was weaving herself into his life, into Ellie's, and every time he tried to push the feeling down, it grew stronger like a river cutting through stone. He didn't know if it was love, not yet, but it was something, and it scared him as much as it warmed him. The neighbors, though, weren't so easily swayed. Mrs. Haskell stopped by with a basket of eggs, her face tight with suspicion. "Heard about the ruckus last night," she said, eyeing Tala, who was brushing the mare in the corral. "You sure you know what you're doing? Jed keeping her here's like inviting a storm into your house." "She ain't the storm," Jed replied, his voice calm but firm. "She's the one weathering it." Mrs. Haskell huffed, but when Tala brought her a salve for her aching joints a day later, made from sage and desert herbs, the old woman's grumbling softened. Others followed Crane's boy, asked Tala for a poultice for a cut, and the widow down the valley took her advice on brewing tea for sleepless nights. Tala's quiet kindness was chipping away at their distrust, one small act at a time, and Jed couldn't help but admire her for it. Ellie, true to form, ignored every warning Jed gave her about keeping her distance. "Tala's my friend," she declared one afternoon, dragging her slate to the shed where Tala was mending a torn shirt. "I'm teaching her dog today." Tala laughed, her voice soft as she repeated the word, her accent thick but earnest. Jed leaned against the doorway, watching them, his heart caught between exasperation and pride. "You're gonna drive me to an early grave, girl," he said, but his smile betrayed him. He let them be, knowing Ellie's stubborn heart was stronger than his rules. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the mountains gold, Jed found Tala by the creek, washing clothes in the fading light. Her sleeves were rolled up her arms, strong and scarred, and the way the water caught the sunset made her look like something out of a dream. He stopped short, his boots crunching on the gravel, and she looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You're staring," she said, a teasing note in her voice. "Caught me," he admitted, his face warming. He stepped closer, picking up a wet shirt to wring it out, their hands brushing as he passed it back. The touch lingered, her fingers cool against his, and he saw her cheeks flush just for a moment. "You're good for her," he said, nodding toward the house where Ellie was humming inside. "For both of us." Tala's smile was small, almost shy. "You're good for me too, Jed Carter." The words hung between them, simple but heavy, and for a moment he wanted to pull her close to see if her warmth could chase away the ghosts that still haunted him. But he stepped back, clearing his throat, and the moment passed, leaving only the sound of the creek and the promise of something more. That promise held them through the next few days, fragile but growing like a seedling in rocky soil. But the quiet didn't last. One morning, as Jed herded the cattle toward the lower pasture, a low rumble broke the stillness. He looked up, his heart sinking as a cloud of dust rose from the valley's edge. More than 30 riders approached their horses, kicking up red dirt, their spears glinting in the sun. Drums echoed deep and steady, and the sight of their feathered headdresses told him these weren't the raiders from before. This was something bigger, something that carried the weight of tradition and power. Jed's first thought was Ellie. He dropped the rope, sprinting back to the ranch, his boots pounding the earth. "Ellie Tala," he shouted, bursting through the door. Ellie was at the table, her eyes wide, a half-eaten biscuit in her hand. Tala was already at the window, her face pale but resolute. It's them, she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. My people. Ain't no time for talk, Jed said, grabbing his rifle. Ellie, get to the cellar. Now! He didn't wait for her to argue, lifting her and carrying her to the shed where the root cellar's hatch was hidden under a pile of sacks. Stay quiet, darlin', he said, kissing her forehead. Don't come out till I say. Ellie nodded, her small hands clutching his shirt, and he closed the hatch, his heart twisting. Back outside, the riders had reached the yard, their horses snorting, their faces stern under the morning sun. Jed pulled Tala behind him, his rifle raised, his finger hovering over the trigger. The leader, a tall man with weathered skin and a headdress of eagle feathers, dismounted, his presence filling the air like a storm cloud. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked on Jed. You harbor my blood, he said, his voice deep and commanding. Step aside, white man. Jed's grip tightened, his jaw set. Ain't nobody taking her unless she wants to go. He felt Tala's hand on his arm, a fleeting touch, but before he could speak, she stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Cha-oi, she cried, throwing herself between Jed and the man. Don't do this. He saved me. Her words hung in the air, raw and desperate, and Jed froze, the rifle still raised but his heart pounding. The man's face didn't change, but his eyes shifted to Tala, a flicker of something pain, maybe breaking through his stoic mask. Tala, he said, his voice softer but still heavy with authority. You belong with your people, not in this dusty place living like a farmer's wife. He gestured to the ranch, the corral, the sagging fences, his disdain clear. This is not your life. Tala stood taller, her hands clenched at her sides. Here I'm myself, she said, her voice steady now, though her eyes glistened. Not a prize, not a bargaining chip, just Tala. Jed's chest tightened, pride and fear mixing as he watched her face down the man who could only be her father, Goyakla, the Apache chief she'd spoken of. The other warriors watched, their faces unreadable, their spears glinting. Jed kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the crowd, knowing one wrong move could turn the yard into a bloodbath. But Tala's words held them all, a fragile thread keeping the peace. Goyakla's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to Tala, his shadow falling over her like a mountain. You shame your blood, he said, his voice low but sharp, each word cutting deeper than the last. You choose this man, this life over your people, over me. His hand gestured toward Jed, who stood silent, his rifle still raised, his body a shield between Ellie's hiding place and the warriors. Tala's shoulders trembled, but her gaze didn't waver. I choose freedom, Cha, she said, her voice breaking but firm. You raised me to be strong, to fight for what's right. This is right for me, for them. She glanced at Jed, her eyes softening for a moment, and he felt it again, that pull, that warmth like a fire he couldn't douse. They're my family now. The words hit Goyakla like a blow, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching the reins of his horse. The warriors behind him shifted, their murmurs low, their eyes darting between their chief and the woman who defied him. Jed's heart pounded, his mind racing with the weight of what was unfolding. He'd known Tala was running from something big, but standing face to face with a chief, with a father, made it real in a way that chilled him to the bone. One of the older warriors, his face lined with years of sun and struggle, stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying weight. Goyakla, look at her, he said, nodding toward Tala. She's not bound, not beaten. She stands tall, not as a prisoner, but as a woman who chose her path. Another elder nodded his eyes on the bracelets Tala had woven still tied around Ellie's slate, visible through the shed's open door. She lives with honor here, not shame. Goyakla's gaze flicked to the bracelets, then back to Tala, and for the first time, Jed saw a crack in the chief's resolve, a flicker of doubt of pain. The old man's shoulders sagged just slightly, and he turned away, staring out at the desert where the mountains loomed like silent judges. The silence stretched heavy and tense until he reached into his pouch and pulled out a silver bracelet, its surface etched with symbols Jed didn't understand, but knew meant something deep. "If you ever lose your way," Goyakla said, his voice rough, "bring this back to us." Tala took the bracelet, her fingers trembling as she closed them around it. She didn't speak, didn't cry, but her eyes held a storm of emotions: gratitude, sorrow, defiance. Goyakla mounted his horse, his movements slow, deliberate, and the warriors followed their drums, silent now. Jed lowered his rifle, his arm aching, and met the chief's gaze. He gave a single nod, a gesture of respect, of understanding from one man to another who'd faced the pain of letting go. Goyakla returned it, his eyes lingering on Tala one last time, before he turned his horse and led the band away, their hoofbeats fading into the dust. Tala stood frozen, the bracelet clutched in her hand until the last rider disappeared over the ridge. Jed stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost afraid to break the quiet. She nodded, her eyes still on the horizon. "I didn't think he'd let me go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not without a fight." "He loves you," Jed said, surprising himself with the words. "Ain't easy letting someone you love choose their own way." He thought of Sarah, of the nights he'd spent wishing he could have held her longer, and his throat tightened. Tala turned to him, her eyes searching his, and for a moment they stood there, the desert stretching around them, the weight of the morning settling like dust. Then she smiled, a small, real smile, and it was enough to make his heart feel full again. They walked back to the shed where Ellie peeked out from the cellar, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes bright. "Is the scary man gone?" she asked, climbing into Tala's arms. "Yeah, sunshine," Tala said, hugging her tight. "He's gone." Ellie grinned, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened, and Jed felt a gratitude so deep it hurt. This was his family now, not just by blood, but by choice, and he'd fight for it same as Tala had. That evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire, Jed sat on the porch carving a small horse for Ellie. Tala joined him, her basket of willow strips in her lap, and they worked in silence, the kind that didn't need words. Ellie ran circles in the yard, chasing a grasshopper, her laughter echoing through the dusk. Jed glanced at Tala, her profile soft in the fading light, and felt that warmth again, steady and sure. "You ever think about what's next?" he asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer. Tala's hands paused, her eyes on the horizon. "I used to think about running forever," she said. "Now I think about staying." She looked at him, her smile small but real, and he knew in that moment that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The Arizona sun hung low, casting a warm glow over the ranch, but Jed Carter was sweating for reasons beyond the heat. "This old barn's gonna be the death of me," he muttered, hammering a plank into place on the old cattle shed, his hands rough from days of sawing and sanding. The shed, once a sagging heap of weathered wood, was taking shape as something new, a small tea house set right along the cattle trail where drovers and travelers passed. Tala's idea, born from quiet talks by the fire, had turned into a plan to bridge the gap between their little world and the folks beyond it. Jed wasn't sure it'd work, not with the town's whispers still lingering like dust after a storm, but Tala's determination was a force he couldn't argue with, and truth be told, he didn't want to. Tala moved through the new space with purpose. Her sleeves rolled up as she scrubbed an old table, her braids swinging with each motion. She'd taken to cooking Apache dishes, fry bread, thick with the scent of cornmeal, and stews simmered with wild herbs she gathered from the hills. Ellie, never far from her side, stood on a stool, her small hands dusted with flour as she shaped dough into lumpy biscuits. "These are going to be the best, Tala," she said, her grin wide, oblivious to the mess on her apron. Tala smiled, brushing a streak of flour from Ellie's cheek, and Jed caught the moment from the doorway, his hammer pausing. The sight of them together laughing in the morning light stirred something deep in him, a warmth that felt like home, not just a place, but a feeling he'd thought he'd lost forever. The tea house opened on a Saturday, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread and brewed tea. At first, folks were wary, their eyes lingering on Tala, her dark hair and quiet grace marking her as different. But hunger and curiosity won out. A drover, his hat worn and dusty, took a bite of Tala's fry bread and nodded his gruff, "This ain't half bad," the closest thing to praise she'd get. Soon others followed, ranchers, traders, even Mrs. Haskell, who'd once called Tala trouble. "Your stew's got a kick," the old woman said, her tone grudging, but her plate clean. Tala just nodded, her smile small but steady, and Jed saw the town's hard edges softening one meal at a time. The tea house became a bridge not just for Tala and the townsfolk, but for the Apache and the settlers, a place where stories and food mingled, where distrust gave way to shared tables. Life settled into a rhythm simple but full, and Jed felt the change in his bones. He and Tala moved around each other with an ease that spoke louder than words. She'd hand him a mug of coffee in the morning, their fingers brushing, and he'd catch himself staring at the way her eyes caught the light like polished obsidian. One afternoon, as they stacked firewood together, their hands grazed over a log, and she laughed, her cheeks flushing. "You're clumsy for a cowboy," she teased, and he grinned, his heart tripping over itself. He didn't say he loved her, not yet, but every time he fixed a loose board for her or watched her braid Ellie's hair, he felt it steady and sure, like the beat of a drum. Ellie, too, claimed Tala in her own way. "Ma Nyo," she called her one evening, the words slipping out as she hugged Tala's waist, her face buried in the woman's apron. Tala froze, her eyes glistening, and Jed looked away, his throat tight. He didn't correct. Ellie didn't say a word, just let the name settle, a quiet truth that bound them closer. They were a family now, not by blood, but by choice, their days filled with small moments. Ellie's laughter, Tala's soft humming, Jed's steady presence that wove them together tighter than any rope. One morning, as Tala swept the tea house floor, a young boy from town dropped off a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Came for you," he said, scampering off before Tala could ask more. She unfolded the cloth, revealing a woven scarf, its edges embroidered with Apache patterns, bold and intricate. Tucked inside was a note written in a careful hand. "Cha still sits by the fire each night." He looked south. Tala's fingers traced the words, her face unreadable, and Jed, watching from the doorway, felt a pang of unease. "Your kin?" he asked, his voice low, not wanting to pry but needing to know. "My cousin Tala," said, folding the scarf with care. "She's young still with the tribe." She paused, her eyes distant, then smiled a small, wistful thing. "He's waiting for me, I reckon, but I'm here now." She tucked the scarf into a wooden chest by the hearth, closing the lid with a soft thud, and Jed let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He didn't ask more, didn't need to. Her choice was clear, and it was enough. As summer faded, the three of them rode out one evening, the horses kicking up dust under a sky streaked with fire. Jed led the way, his hat tilted against the setting sun, while Tala rode beside him, her posture easy, her eyes bright. Ellie sat in front of Tala, giggling as the horse jogged, her small hands clutching the reins. The grassland stretched wide around them, endless and free, and Jed felt a peace he hadn't known in years. They weren't bound by blood, not tied by law or tradition, but their hearts beat in time, a rhythm built on trust, on nights spent fighting for each other, on mornings filled with laughter and fry bread. Family, he realized, wasn't about where you came from. It was about who you chose to stand with, who you'd bleed for, who you'd live for. They reined in at a rise, the mountains looming dark against the horizon, and Ellie pointed at the stars just starting to wink above. "Look, Manyo, it's your name," she said, her voice bright, and Tala laughed, her hand resting on Ellie's shoulder. Jed looked at them, his chest full, and knew this was home, not the ranch, not the tea house, but the three of them together, choosing each other every day. He reached for Tala's hand, his fingers lacing with hers, and she squeezed back her smile, saying what words didn't need to. Out here in the vast, quiet desert, they'd found something stronger than fear, something worth every fight, a life built on courage, on love, on the simple act of staying. And that's the end of our story, my friends. Whew. What a journey. Right? This story wasn't just about an Apache girl on the run or a lonely cowboy trying to keep his daughter safe. It was about the courage to choose love over fear, to protect what matters, even when the world stands against you. It was about healing not through grand gestures, but through the quiet kindness of everyday moments, sharing a meal, teaching a word, offering a safe place to sleep. To me, this story is a powerful reminder that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up, who fight for you, who stay when things get hard. Jed, Tala, and Ellie. Three souls from different worlds built something real together. Not perfect, not easy, but honest. And isn't that what we're all searching for? It also made me reflect on prejudice and the fear of the other. How many good hearts have we overlooked just because they look or sound different? Tala faced judgment simply for existing, but slowly, through her resilience and tenderness, she changed minds. That's the kind of quiet bravery I deeply admire. So tell me, what part of the story moved you the most? Was it Tala standing up to her father, Jed risking it all to protect someone the world said he shouldn't? Or maybe little Ellie calling her Ma Nyo for the first time? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Truly. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes in second chances, healing, and the power of chosen family. See you in the next story. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and stay brave.